Hello from Arkadaş. Today's question is, I didn't choose to be created of my own will. Isn't it unfair for me to go to hell if I deny Islam? This is the question being asked. What do you think about this?
Allah disposes of His property as He wishes. We cannot interfere with Him. The property is His. Here we need to know our place. Now let's try to understand the issue. Now this friend has been created, has come into existence, will go to an eternal life with his loved ones, and will be happy. Assuming that our brother who asked this question is asking sincerely, I want to say this. If this friend goes to paradise, what problem would he have? In paradise, together with his loved ones, there are endless layers, levels, and degrees. Would it be bad if he tried to attain the highest ranks? The answer to this question has been given completely in the 24th letter. It's a very long lesson. Let's just give one or two sentences and a couple of examples from there. We all owe everything to Allah. He created us as humans. First and foremost, He brought us from non-existence into the realm of existence. What does this mean? Out of infinite possibilities, we came into being through a single possibility. In the realm of existence, we could have been inanimate, or we could have been animals. He brought us into existence as humans, which is the highest and most superior of all levels of life. He gave us eyes, ears, senses, and such blessings and subtleties that we could never finish counting them. He adorned the universe with blessings around us and made it serve us. The entire universe serves us. From its sun, its clouds, its soil, all the elements are at our service. Along with all this, He introduced us to our loved ones and will send us together with them to eternal happiness, to an everlasting paradise, making us happy forever. We have such a God. When we have such a God to be grateful for, why should we rebel against Him? First of all, let us realize how much we owe Him. God does not owe us anything. We are indebted to Him. He has given us more than we deserve. If instead of comparing ourselves to others we were grateful to Him, He wants to forgive us and admit us to His paradise. So what is our problem? He will grant us eternal happiness.
There was a saying in the Nebi Selam Nükulat, O human, complaint, that is, grievance, arises from a right. None of your rights have been violated, so why are you complaining? In fact, there are many rights over you. Without fulfilling God's rights, you are complaining unjustly, it says. It's very striking.
Actually, if we don't fall for the tricks of the ego and Satan, a beautiful life awaits us. But paradise is not cheap. Can such eternal happiness be cheap? Of course, we have come to prepare for eternal life. Therefore, instead of listening to the words of the ego and Satan, we must listen to truth and reality in the Quran, and by submitting to God's commands, attain eternal happiness. Let us briefly answer in this way and refer to that topic, because it is a very lengthy subject. It is not possible for us to explain all of it here. But let this brother know that when he reads the 24th letter or listens to that lesson, there will be no questions left in his mind. I can guarantee that he will be content with all the conditions, saying, I choose life, I choose this test, this trial, everything is actually wonderful. Let's elaborate a bit more on the answer you gave from the perspective of conscience and fairness. Let's also try to explain it further using other points from the Risale-i Nur. Now, at this point, the issue is actually not as we know it. There are aspects we are unaware of. For example, in the Quran, there is a testimony from the covenant of Alastu, the primordial covenant. Since this subject is very deep and pertains to the unseen, for now, let's elaborate on the matter intellectually using the Risale-i Nur without delving into that topic. Now, a person who says, I did not choose to exist rather than not exist, must first know what non-existence actually is. What is the nature of non-existence? It is very difficult to explain what non-existence is to someone who does not know its nature. When we began our answer there, we mentioned a principle. The owner of the property has the right to dispose of it as he wishes. This principle is very important. It is Allah who created man. Man is a creation. He did not create himself. In no way can he claim to possess existence in himself. There is someone who made him. Therefore, the one who made him, the owner of that property, acts as he wishes with his property and is accountable to no one. Indirectly, when creating man, he does not do so according to man's desires, but according to the manifestation of the Creator's infinite knowledge and wisdom. In other words, if there is a 1% share that concerns the created, 99% concerns the Creator. Just as an artist does not ask the painting when creating it, because the artist is expressing his art in the painting. There are many wisdoms and benefits that pertain to the artist. The share that pertains to the painting itself may be just 1%. He acts not according to human knowledge, but according to his own infinite knowledge and wisdom, his boundless knowledge and wisdom. For example, when a doctor gives you a medicine you may not like, you might object, but he treats you not according to your knowledge, but according to his own knowledge. It is obvious how meaningless it is when you object to this. In other words, no matter how much a person says I, in reality he does not own himself, he did not create himself, and he does not govern himself. He does not have control either, he has not done anything himself. Just as he did not make the organs in his body, he also does not sustain the life of those organs himself. He has no share in providing all the necessary cells and nutrients for those organs. For this reason, a person cannot take ownership of himself. Therefore, ownership belongs to Allah. He disposes of His property as He wills. This is an unchanging principle. Now, if we approach this question in the light of truth, this question is already a wrong question. In fact, it is not even a question. It is an objection that the ego presents as if it were the truth. The question claims, I did not choose to come into existence, or I was not asked about coming into existence. If we think about it a little, the emptiness beneath the question will become apparent. You didn't exist. How can we ask a question to someone who does not exist? Therefore, you did not exist in the first place. Just as it is impossible for someone who does not exist to have a say in this matter, only someone who knows both existence and non-existence can make a choice between the two. In other words, here, someone who knows existence and non-existence, who knows their nature, is choosing existence on your behalf, despite non-existence. If the approach of why wasn't I asked were a logical one, then no one would have children. At this point, humanity's collective answer to this issue must be that existence has always been preferred over non-existence. Today, we say that humanity exists. The existence of humanity means that existence has been preferred over non-existence. If you were to ask your child, would you like to come into life, so to speak, since such a thing is not possible, a choice is being made on their behalf here. Someone who knows life, on their behalf, even taking all the risks and knowing death as well, still preferred life over their non-existence. Now let's imagine a child saying to his father, why didn't you ask me before bringing me into the world? Let's suppose he says that. This idea then goes against general logic. At that point, it doesn't have any real foundation in truth anyway. Now this child says to his father, you brought me into the world without asking me, so I rebel against you. If he were to say this, it is obvious how illogical and unfair it would be. Here is the subtle point. If, despite death, a short life, and even with all its risks coming into existence, is preferred over non-existence and outweighs it, then what does it mean to have an infinite, eternal, endless life where there is no death, no illness, no hardship, and where happiness and joy last forever? Of course, preferring this over non-existence is an absolute and definite good. Since we do not know what eternal and infinite life truly is, someone who knows the nature of eternal life has made the choice on our behalf. He has chosen our existence over our non-existence. If we object to this without knowing how great a reward and compensation it truly is, such an objection would be unjust. So when a person enters eternal life, will they really object to it? That is a separate question for when one understands its true nature. In other words, to be justified, one must know what eternal happiness truly is.
So what we understand is that coming into existence is a tremendous blessing. For a person to object after having received this blessing would result in a great torment. In other words, it would have severe consequences.
At this point, in order to discover the truth, one must detach themselves from the ego and self-centeredness. Now, when we look at ourselves from the outside, would you consent to a person who could have eternal life and eternal happiness, instead falling into eternal non-existence, that is, absolute nothingness? We can't make such a decision about a person, can we? Even a person who possesses the slightest trace of true humanity could never consent to someone being condemned to eternal non-existence instead of eternal life. In other words, one cannot prefer eternal non-existence, absolute nothingness, over eternal life. And when the subject is not someone else but ourselves, we still do not have the right to change this answer. In fact, no one has the right to do this to themselves either. After all, what leads a person to hell is that, through their wrong choices and rebellions, they cause themselves, their own soul, to lose eternal life, that is, eternal paradise. And the punishment God gives in return for losing eternal happiness is just that. The only fitting consequence for that is hell.
So what you just mentioned is a very subtle nuance. In fact, God created humans for eternal paradise, and in order for us to become worthy of it, He shapes us in this world, so to speak, like dough, molding us into a state fit for paradise. But it is the person who, by their own will, chooses to go to hell.
Well, would it have any meaning to be there without knowing what eternal happiness is?
Of course it wouldn't.
So it means we also need some preparation. As we already mentioned in our previous answer, paradise is not cheap. We are here to earn it, to prepare for that eternal life. In fact, if we question this in our own choices, we will see the answer. For example, in our own lives, we always choose life over death. Why does a person ask this question instead of ending their life? The very existence of this question actually shows a desire to choose life. In other words, despite everything, they choose to live. Let's divide it into two options. If a person believes in God, their choice to live is proof that they prefer life, and because they believe, they also believe in eternal life. Because God has infinite wisdom and infinite knowledge, the person has shown submission to Him and chosen to live. If they do not believe, their choice to live is proof that they prefer existence over non-existence, because for them, death is non-existence. Therefore, they could end their life and go to eternal non-existence, but they choose to live. In other words, if a person believes in God, they do not ask this question, nor can they, because they did not create themselves and they are the work of a God with infinite wisdom. They know that trusting in His infinite wisdom, they have come to prepare for an eternal life. In other words, they have no right of disposal. By believing in God, they have submitted to God's infinite wisdom. God has chosen eternal happiness for them on their behalf. At this point, let us not be misled by the fact that some people commit suicide. They are not actually comparing life and non-existence and choosing non-existence. Generally, they commit suicide because the test of life feels too heavy for them because they cannot pass the test. Moreover, because they do not draw strength or power from faith, they become helpless. Because human beings are created for prayer, they are created weak. By attributing themselves to an owner of infinite power and praying to him, they can remain standing. Since they cannot find this point of attribution, the test becomes too heavy for them, and generally they commit suicide. Otherwise, they are not committing suicide as a choice between existence and non-existence. Let this point not mislead us. Let us state this as a side note. In this context, for a beautiful work of art to say to its artist, "Why didn't you ask me before creating or making me?" is the ultimate expression of absurdity. If he does not believe, then according to his belief, death is eternal non-existence. In that case, he may prefer non-existence over existence. In fact, both our choices and our continuation of life, that is, the answer that comes from our nature, is to choose and desire to live. Therefore, our own choices, preferences, and nature contradict the words we say. If someone saved your life and then said, "In return you will thank me every day," what would you say?
You'd say, is that even worth mentioning? What does a thank you mean compared to a life?
Or if while you were on your deathbed, someone brought you a medicine and said, "This medicine will extend your life by 5 years," and it truly did extend your life by 5 years, what would you give in return for that medicine?
Normally, people would give up their entire fortune. I mean, living 5 more years is a very serious matter. In other words, you would give your entire fortune for this outcome.
A person who answers these questions honestly will understand how indebted we are for what God has given us and how much we should be grateful. What is the simplest thing you see, for example, in a person's ability to breathe in and out? Even the fact that the control of our eyes is not given to us is such a great blessing. The blessings given to us from the external world and our inner world within our bodies are so numerous that it is impossible for us to count, understand, or comprehend them all here. As we referenced at the beginning of our question with the 24th letter, what does it mean, first and foremost, to come into existence from non-existence? In other words, we cannot even comprehend what a blessing it is for you to come into existence as one possibility out of infinite possibilities. Moreover, each level of existence, every single step, is a distinct blessing, a unique favor and gift. Therefore, in the face of so many blessings, our only duty is servitude, worship, faith, and obedience to Allah. When we consider all of this together, it becomes clear and evident that this question arises from the deceptions of the ego and Satan.
May Allah be pleased with you. That was a very sufficient answer. Thank you. See you, friends. May you be entrusted to Allah.